observe this. There are amorphous situations in which the two types of conflicts mixed either horizontally or vertically, that means spatially or temporally. That is the commencement of dual hostilities, internal and international, simultaneously or consecutively, such as what happened in Baghdad and recently in Afghanistan. It may further be noted that although state is obligated to follow the Geneva Conventions, rebels seldom follow the provisions of the conventions. So the asymmetry of warfare is another important complicated situation. There, one party is supposed to oblige the rules of war and rules of conflict, and the other party need not be. Another important aspect is that the treatment of POWs, whether they will be treated as POWs or not, even those people who are already detained. So the important thing is that the Article 3 is not very clear or silent on the question of general protection of civilian population. It generally, it gives with certain general standards, but not explaining it in a very descriptive way that would be helpful when the rule is to be applied in the actual conflicts. Then what happens when the whole thing has been enlarged in Protocol 2? Whether the protocol is complete, the Protocol 2 is complete. Protocol 2 is no doubt an improvement over Common Article 3, but there are some lacunae found by critics. The following are the lacunae they pinpointed. There are no provisions on methods and means of warfare. There is no provision granting general protection to civilian objects. No specific provision against indiscriminate attack on objects. There is no provision dealing with combatants or prisoners of war. These are all lacunae. Now, in both Common Article 3 and Protocol 2, penal prosecutions of nationals are left to the national prosecutions. Authorities are provided with broad powers of amnesty. The same Azhar Institute study and its findings says that no criminal enforcement mechanism is envisaged for crimes committed in non-international armed conflict. These were not war crimes, strictly speaking, although they were prohibited acts committed during war, but crimes under national law. In an international sense, they could be considered as unlawful acts rather than crimes. But establishment of ICTR and ICTY, they became game changer because they interpreted a different way what was the conventional interpretation that we have seen so far and how that has changed today. The finding of appellate chamber decision in Tadic case on jurisdiction of International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, that Common Article 3 and the core of AP2 can give rise to individual criminal responsibility for the commission of war crimes charges. Now this is a departure, this is a real departure in interpretation. But one has to understand here, the application of international humanitarian law as a part of general international law is different from application for criminal purposes, because these two things are different. And this dilemma always, you can find in all the decisions of ICJ, nuclear test case, and whether you go for the other case, Wall case. In most of the cases where the international humanitarian law comes into interplay with human rights or the laws relating to occupation, there used to be conflicting versions given by the courts, and we are not very sure what the intention is. We will discuss later. So, the findings was made on the basis of Common Article 3 in Tadic was that the core of the Protocol 2 as well as Common Article put together they become customary international law. This means state strict adherence to Common Article 3 would not absolve a military commander and other responsible persons from war crimes as the violations of Common Article 3 and AP 2 are considered as crimes under customary international law and under Roman statute. That is the TADIS. Now, TADIS standard is taken for all international crimes. But at the same time, as far as the violation of international humanitarian law, in matters of application of international humanitarian law in war, actual conflict, or a non-international armed conflict, and this stream appears to be little different from the stream that we are looking in TADIS and other cases. The importance of this approach has been highlighted Professor Theodore Meron in the following manner. And he says that the effort of the tribunals, or what the tribunals, the impact of the tribunals' decisions, that the extension, the development of international humanitarian law and its extension to non-international armed conflict is significant. But at the same time, this advance can be explained by the pressure in the face of atrocities for a rapid adjustment of law, process and institutions. So the challenge he pinpoints here is that a rapid adjustment of law that is happening in TADIS and other cases there. Then there is a process, that change that is contemplated there. And the institutional focus is also there for that. So now the point is that when you look as a general international law issue, then you look at the international criminal law issue, this is going to be different. And how do we go about this? See, the important thing here is that no matter how many atrocities cases these international tribunals may eventually try, says Professor Meron, the procedure, the very existence sends a powerful message. Their statutes, rules of procedure, and evidence and practice stimulate the development of the law. Now the issue here is whether these two developments, one from the standpoint of international humanitarian law, the another from the standpoint of international criminal law, whether that is, it is something like a development in parallel track, or it is trying to converge something. So that is a real challenge, and this has to be looked very carefully. So now today, the determination of the non-international armed conflict, leaving intervention by courts, because the intervention of the courts happens only after post factum, not before that. But before that, if you go for an application of law, the international humanitarian law, the law needs to be stipulated very clearly. The gaps needs to be filled. If you want to bridge whatever the development that has taken place in TADIS and other cases, along with the general stream of the regular or a customary interpretation of international humanitarian law, and there must be something to bridge these two. If these two things are separate, looked separate, and it is going to be a problem. So this is one important message I want to convey. Yeah. Then the second issue is the interplay of international humanitarian law and human rights law. And this matter, I think, would have been discussed here in this forum, or else people must know, well aware of that. The point is that the international humanitarian law, the role of international humanitarian law, and the international human rights law. International human rights law is normally recognized as a peacetime law, and humanitarian law is normally looked as a law that to be applied only during conflicts, whether international conflicts or non-international conflicts. Now the question comes in when they discuss this in Wall's case, especially with regard to the occupation, especially the Israeli occupation. the question came in there, when will you apply the human rights law? When will you apply international humanitarian law? The court has come that there are situations, without even referring to the situation, the court said that certain situation warrants the strict application of humanitarian law, certain other situation warrants the application of international human rights law, certain other situation warrants application of both. They mentioned this now. But at the same time, the conflict is the international humanitarian law all times to be followed. International human rights law has a rider, a control factor, that is the derogable rights, the derogability. In case of emergency, and those rights will be suspended. Naturally, a warlike situation is this thing. Really, it will be exempted. Unless and until that right is non-derogable rights, then you can say that all right, that right exists. Now, another important problem is indicated here. What's the problem? The problem is that if we apply this international humanitarian law and at the same time international human rights law, the international human rights law by nature, it is applied vertically. International humanitarian law is applied horizontally. Vertically means what? Against state, and where the states have a duty to protect. So these two things, I think this matter has not yet been settled very clearly. But there is some innate connection between there. And there are people now, they argue that the two rights, they emerged as just cogents. The international humanitarian law has emerged as just cogents, and international human rights also emerges as just cogents. Then the two things are again as just cogents. Then how will you set priority? This is the issue. Another conflicting decision has been given now in another case, that is the Germany versus Italy, ICJ. And where the court says that when there is a conflict between a customary international law and just cogents, if it is the customary international law that is most important one that is applied all times, then even in preference to the just cogents, where the just cogents they refer about again the international humanitarian law, you must give way to customary international law than just cogents. Now this is much more complicated. So that is why the issues again and again you get deeper into it as a practitioner, as an advisor, then it is still it poses a greater problem when you get deeper into it. But at the same time, how to reconcile these things? Something need to be done by creation of a soft law, and sometimes a treaty, a new treaty. I don't think new treaty is possible, but there kind of a soft law that can be created, and that will in fact bridge these two. Still have a time or what? Stop here and answer the questions I need.
We were allowed some extra time because we began late, but to stand between you and your coffee, I would like, if it's possible, to carry on for another 50, thank you. I'd just like to, because our colleague has to leave, if we have questions relating to the first contribution, and then Dr. Gandhi will continue for another 10 minutes. So before we you would have questions now with respect to the refugee aspects. Yes, please.
Good morning to all present. I'm Pari. I'm a student at Jindal Global Law School. My question to you is, as far as the IDPs are concerned, and you mentioned specifically that the regime of refugee law cannot in its entirety apply for the reasons of state sovereignty. To that extent, how does UNHCR then distinguish its mandate towards the refugees and IDPs? And to what extent then it also assists IDPs in terms of like helping them in their reintegration and the other mandates that you mentioned? Thank you.
Good morning, all. This is Anand from Center for International Legal Studies, Jawaharlal University. So my question is to Dominic. This session is about the contemporary challenges. So it's in refugee law we have seen that the trend changed from burden sharing to burden shifting by the Western countries. And if you see, refugees were welcomed in the Western countries during the Cold War from the Soviet bloc to show that the communist countries are very bad in civil and political rights, particularly human rights. Interestingly, we can see that data are there that many US citizens also, soldiers particularly, are given refugee status in Soviet Union. And my question is like, it's about the non-reforma principle. Like the non-reforma principles is the customary international law which says that you cannot send back the refugee back. But now if you see the present tactics of the Western countries, particularly US, and you can see that they are, the refugees are stopped in the middle ways, in the high seas, and send them back. Okay? They make a situation that they cannot need to obey this non-reforma principle at all. And if you see in Africa, this Spain, if I'm not wrong, that they are building a wall in Morocco to stop the refugees coming inside the country. Once they come inside, then they have to follow this non-reform. I think these are the contemporary challenges to this refugee law. So how we are going to deal with this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I apologize if I'm at the origin of disrupting Professor Gandhi's presentation. I'm very sorry. Thank you for the two questions, which I think are very pertinent because they touch upon the evolution of the framework around refugee protection. How does UNHCR distinguish its protection of refugees from IDPs? As I try to suggest, in terms of the international framework, the Refugee Convention, the protocol, and the fact that many states have translated that into national legislation, makes for a very sturdy legal framework in terms of refugee protection. So at that level, I think we have a solid foundation. In terms of extending that to IDPs, it is a much more tenuous environment. There is no overarching equivalent to the Refugee Convention to apply to internally displaced. There is the guiding principles on internal displacement, and there is, if you will, a composite effort of taking pieces of other international covenants to extend that rationale to internally displaced. But at the end of the day, internally displaced are first and foremost internally displaced, meaning that they are presumed to be able to avail themselves of the protection of their own government. Now, in some conflict situations, that is precisely the problem, that they are not able to avail themselves of that protection. And here you will be familiar with the debate that is taking place in the UN amongst member states, how to tackle that. There have been various efforts over time to look at means that would allow the international community to confer at least a modicum of protection in those situations. But this sits very closely to national sovereignty. So rightfully, member states will say, but we don't want that kind of outside extension of a protection model on our own people. So it's an ongoing debate, but clearly what I can confirm is your surmise that in terms of the strength of the legal system, the framework for IDPs is less solid and is still evolving. So your second point is a very complex one, because you're essentially asking about how the evolution in terms of member states' willingness to abide by the convention and to also contribute to the evolution of the application of the convention, how that is faring. You're quite right in pointing out that there's deficiencies and there's emerging trends that suggest that some member states want to almost bypass the refugee convention, want to almost create conditions in which access to those respective countries is well nigh impossible, and therefore the very adjudication of a refugee status is de facto not taking place. These trends do happen. There's many other trends that come into this. We should also point out that very often, of course, we assume that we're talking about refugees, when in fact we're looking at much larger migratory movements. And here our concern has always been that much as there are migratory movements, within those populations on the move, we may well have cases with well-founded fear of persecution who should at least be given an opportunity to present their case. So here, in a way, I'm not really doing justice to your question. I'm amplifying it. I'm confirming that also on the international refugee law front, it is not a static edifice. It is evolving. There's also calls for a review of the convention, of the entire refugee convention. Some member states have suggested that. Others apply it more imaginatively in practice. So I think you put your finger exactly where the hotspot is right now, where the discussion takes place, how to further expand the scope of refugee protection.
Well, thank you. And actually, it brings us back to Dr. Gandhi, the very points that he was making about the need to revise the regime and the interrelation between them. Please carry on.
Now, I discuss only two more issues because the time given is only 10 minutes, 5 minutes I'll take and wind up. The other issue is the important IHL principle that the means and methods of warfare are not unlimited. That means state cannot use any kind of weapons as it likes it. So it again to be controlled by the international humanitarian law. So the humane means and method, we have to use it. Where you can find the role of the Hague rules, how it has got mixed with now the Geneva rules today. Now, what is important here is that the new weapons, when they conceive an idea of new weapons, very often they come and explain when the negotiation is on banning the old weapons, the new weapons would be more precise, it is smart. So all precise weapons, precision weapons, and that will be very good. But at the same time, the actual fights between the negotiating delegations, two polarized, completely polarized negotiating delegations, you can find that one set of delegations, they would always look into the cost of the security. Because the state has to hire, the state has to in fact buy, state has to buy the weapons. Because when for self-defense they need the weapon. If they are going for a sophisticated weapons, it is going to be again costly. And second important thing is that the weapons which are all active, you just keep it, and it is very difficult also to phase it out. The phasing out cost is very high, alarming. So phasing out and acquiring new weapons and all these things added up, it is a new burden for the state, and the state will have to just balance between the humanitarian aspect as well as the security concern. So these two things they have to balance it. Now, you see what all happened in the Ottawa Convention. Then later, that is the first one is the mine ban, the second one is the cluster bomb ban. Now, we are talking about this ATT, and it has also come into force. It is also now wrapped up, and it has been, in fact, ready for the states to sign and ratify. Now, the issue here is that when targeting a person, which kind of weapon can be used, and where, you know the rule, the precaution, proportionality, all kinds of things will come in that. Then at the same time, when you use that, the precaution as well as the proportionality, then whether that weapon would cause collateral damage, how much collateral damage that will cause, then after use of that, using that weapon, how will you recover the unexploded weapons, and all these things are the humanitarian related issues. So the means and methods of warfare is very important, and where now the contemporary challenge is creating autonomous weapons. That means in one way or other, if it is completely controlled by the human beings, it is okay. But if it is left completely controlled by machines, autonomous weapons, the tracing, surveillance, tracing, targeting, everything is done automatically. If that is the case, it is dangerous. But the companies which develop, they come and say that, all right, it's fine because, you know, it is objective. It will all go with ground reality, automatically it fires. Automatically it will be used. So there will not be any malice or ill will. The machine will not have that. But the other side is very important. There is no human element is there. Imagine for a moment that a child which is picking up the AK-47 or some other machinery left out in the street in an urban environment, war is fought or the conflict is there. The automated machines, what it will do? Automated machines will fire automatically. Because the child will be treated as comparative, because it is holding weapon. So this kind of a danger is there. So, but at the same time, you know, when we approach the automated weapon kind of a thing, I think even the last session you had discussion on drones, drone warfare. Drone warfare, at least the human agency is involved in that. Now in the autonomous, then fixing the accountability is also a problem. Because the planners who really plan that you can have this, and they will not be made accountable for that. Because you can't make them accountable for that. Because they are not in the commanding position. They say that this is the situation, fine, you can use this weapon. And the weapon is put there. Then no human agency is involved in that. Then it is going to be a problem. So the another important issue is the new weapons which are all coming, which are all very costly. Only haves can have that weapon, have-nots will not have that weapon. So the security is the issue. The another important issue is the humanitarian issue, because it is a machine and which has to be used. Then how humane the war is going to be, we don't know. That is the important issue with regard to the methods and means of war. Then the private security companies. Private security companies now almost, you know, even war is also outsourced. War is outsourced, conflict is outsourced. The reason is that it will be economical, first thing. And second is, you are completely unaccountable for that. So you can outsource the whole thing. Now the question comes in that, here also, you have to take precaution, 57.1. Then when precautionary measure you take it, how will you take a precautionary measure? Then when the precautionary measure is taken, how much, you know, the responsibility is imputed under state responsibility on the private company when it is outsourced. whether they will be taken as a private person or these people will be taken as civilians or combatants. Because only binary you can find in the international humanitarian law. Either he is a civilian or a combatant. When he is not a combatant, he is a civilian. If this binary is there, it is difficult because in between you don't have categorization. So this is another issue there. Now, how will you address this issue? This is a serious problem now. It is a very important problem also. That when the private companies are used, then what kind of a role it plays? Whether they will come under IHL or they will come under national law, because the country permits the private companies to be linked to their own defense forces. If they are in the defense forces, their own defense forces, it is okay, accountability will be there. But they are not in fact accommodated within their defense structure under defense law, then they are unaccountable. Then the role plays to these companies, whether the companies are only in service to the actual combatants or they are combating. Whether then the companies are treated as mercenaries or not, another question. Whether they will come under mercenary definition or they will not come under the mercenary definition. They are outsourced. So then, on the basis of the role they played, individual person played in that company, on that basis you have to apply rule, and it is going to be very complicated. But it is a serious issue that we have to just look into that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As usual, Dr. Gandhi brings his experience as a scholar and as a government official charged with developing and implementing the law. I think time does not allow questions now, but I think the next session, the debate continues, and the next session will be taking up perhaps in a form of review of the questions we're raising today. So perhaps you can leave it for the conclusion of that session, Dr. Mahan.
Just a short intervention. Your view on the judicial pronouncement, I think that is very, very important and crucial. Perhaps we could have a discussion on that if you can, because we want to see the legal contours, the distinction between, now that it has been muddled up, international humanitarian law, ICC, and then
Other tribunals.
Yes, that's right. If that can be explained further, because this will help the juries especially to have a demarcation. Especially, I'm quite perturbed when you say that where there is a conflict between the jus cogent and international customary law. International customary law prevail. I mean that is something that we have to.
And that is what in Germany.
Yes, that's right. So these are things, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps we could have a further discussion on this. Thank you.
Yeah. No, the individual responsibility for war crimes, then the individual responsibility for commission of genocide and other egregious crimes. Under international criminal law, this is a separate subject, and it is completely governed by treaty, and to a certain extent, it is governed by customary international law. So where it is governed by customary international law, where it is governed by treaty, it is an issue. The International Court of Justice all the time gave importance to the treaty provisions. That means the interpretation is very restrictive if you see the decisions given by the International Court of Justice. But all the ICTY and ICTR, like the criminal tribunals, they are expanding it. And certain crimes can be committed, and see all the egregious crimes that can be committed even in the situation, not in the situation of conflict. Genocide can be committed even a situation where there is no conflict. Genocide can be committed. crimes against humanity can be committed without even a conflict situation. So certain serious crimes, which are all now in Rome Statute, certain things can be committed during the conflict, certain things can be committed during as well as not during the conflict. So there is a clear separation is there. And apart from that, the Article 3 is invoked now, especially in the tribunal. They almost come to a point that Article 3, common Article 3 is customary in tribunal. Some authorities are even gone beyond this and claiming that it becomes just cogence. The problem with when you say that it is a just cogence principle or a customary international law, it is a broader obligation you are talking about, but what are the rules? That standard will have several rules, is it not? Who will prescribe the rules? So a general standard has come. On that basis, either rule should be prescribed, and if there is no rule, the court will lay down that kind of a rule in different cases. So the second point is that court will develop that kind of a rules. The court has not come with that kind of a developed jurisprudence, because it's all started just now. And if you say that the International Criminal Court one part and the International Court of Justice the other part, the onerous duty is on the International Court of Justice, because it is dealing with international law. So international criminal law, it is treaty based by and large today, and international humanitarian law, you have it. Then you have a conflicting problem. Say for example, an arrest warrant case. If it is a crime that has been committed, that is international crime that has been committed, when a state wants to punish whoever is a criminal, now the question comes in that the person happens to be the foreign minister of a country, whether a warrant can be issued under your national law. Now the question comes in, your competency to issue of arrest warrants under your national law involving a foreign dignitary who has an immunity. Then this comes in, then the very important problem of the violation of criminal law, that will take backseat. Because this is very important, this right has been accepted and recognized long time in the history of international relations. So when you say that you mix and match and you say that all right, you have to give importance to the second part of it, he has committed, therefore exemption cannot be created like that. That kind of a thing is possible only by a national court, like what they did in Pinochet. No international court will say ever that kind of a decision is appropriate. So there are problems. There are problems when you apply, when you view this as international law, then all the subtext of international law, like international humanitarian law, jurisdictional issues, customary international law, then you will have a conflicting decisions. So all the conflicting decisions in one way or other, if you want to even benefit out of the international humanitarian law, some kind of at least acceptable soft standards by state that should be in a written form. So you have to go for a mini codification, at least you must make the states to accept that. If there is no acceptance and it remains as a fragmentation, it remains a problem. That is what I stated. Thank you.
Well, thank you for once again a rich contribution. I can say that I had the pleasure of meeting Balthazar Garçon. You mentioned the Pinochet case. I met him for the first time, and I was involved, as you know, as the prosecutor in Spain who brought extradition case against Pinochet, and I was happy there to see that in the courts, I reviewed my own experience in that field, and the courts in the United Kingdom did use the work of the International Law Commission in order to open up the very issue that Dr. Gandhi mentioned. And I would have to say that at least the situation has been clarified greatly by the ICC, which, as Dr. Gandhi has said, is a mixture of the various forms. And I think, for instance, one of the problems with the ICC is the conflation of grave breaches with humanitarian crimes and so forth. But at least now we have a body of law which a lot of countries abide by or are party to. I think the situation is better than when the Yugoslav tribunal was acting alone. And I think that I would just as a footnote that my former tribunal has dealt with the question of fragmentation in the context of the law of the sea and following up on the work of Kashkaniemi on fragmentation. So I think the situation is getting better, even though the world is getting more complicated. Legally, it's getting clearer. So having said that, can we pass then to, I guess, with the organizers? Well, I'm afraid we have no time for. But will you? What the next steps? How are we skipping the coffee, or are we skipping the coffee or not?
Professor Gandhi, thank you very much, and in absence, of course, many thanks to Mr. Dominic Barge from UNHCR. At this time, we would break for a coffee, and we shall return the half an hour allocated slot. Unless we agree that we 15 minutes is okay? Okay, so it's now 11:30. We invite you to coffee, and we shall resume at 11:45. Thank you very much.
Sorry, it's undemocratic.
That's why you have experience. By watching, I learn. I'm a visual learner. It's not hot here. It's cold.
But Jevin is not here today. I talked with him yesterday. Yeah, he told me too. He's probably
Hi.
Hi, how are you? Okay.
Once more. Organizers. It's fine.